Welcome back to Derry Public Radio. Reporting from the basement of the Derry Civic Center, this is CM Alexander with the news. Best-selling horror author Stephen King has been declared missing, last seen heading east out of nearby Bangor shortly before this weekend's record-breaking nor'easter hit. According to authorities, King's car was found run off the road not 10 miles away from my own home on the outskirts of Derry. What a coincidence. I am, after all, his number one fan. You are listening to Derry Public Radio. This is Derry Public Radio.
Welcome back to Derry Public Radio, a bi-weekly Stephen King book club podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Joshua Kahn, alongside CM Alexander.
Hello, everyone.
And Benjamin Graham.
What's up, constant readers?
Today we are on part 1 of Misery, covering all the way through part 2 through chapter 12, if you're reading along. If you're not, major spoilers ahead. Today, we've got CM leading us through our discussion. So CM, you ready to take it away?
Thanks, Josh. Misery is the tale of Annie Wilkes, a lonely nurse misunderstood by all those around her, who saves the life of an ungrateful author, Paul Sheldon. That's how you guys read this, right?
Completely how that
Annie
plays.
Wilkes, the most misunderstood character in literature.
Noble and heroic, I would say.
Okay, so Misery is actually about a famous author, Paul Sheldon, best known for his Victorian-era romance novels about heroine Misery Chastain. And Paul gets caught in a snowstorm and crashes his car. He's rescued by a former nurse, Annie Wilkes, who happens to be his number one fan. And when Annie finds out that Paul has killed off Misery in his latest book, she forces him to write a new book, bringing Misery back. And Annie's bedside manner leaves a little to be desired.
I would certainly say, she does legitimately save his life.
Okay,
so
let's cut to the chase. Annie Wilkes is a lunatic.
She's insane.
She is also one of my favorite Stephen King characters. I want to ask you guys.
Yeah.
Who is worse, Margaret White or Annie Wilkes?
Annie Wilkes. Because my
CM doesn't know.
So,
It's a
I was going to explain
toss-up.
to give CM some time while she was trying to process it.
Oh God, I hate that I'm going to have to say this so soon in the episode, but I never felt bad for Margaret at any point. I felt a little sympathy for Annie once or twice.
I can't wait to talk more about that later.
Yeah, 'cause that's interesting.
This book scared me. Like I've as I'm reading it, I am scared because Annie is so 0 to 60 that it is terrifying how fast she turns.
And the book wastes no time getting into it.
True.
That's my favorite part.
Yeah, it gets to it right away. And the first chapter is interesting because we kick that off with 4 lines of gibberish as Paul starts to drift in and out of consciousness, and all he knows at this point is pain. And he starts dreaming about a childhood memory of going to the beach with his parents, and his mind is focusing on this one specific event, as if his brain's trying to tell him, okay, there's something really wrong here.
I read this book in high school, and I remember it being one of the best books I've ever read. This was in the beginning of my King fandom. The metaphor of the pylon that Paul Sheldon sees as a kid has stuck with me my entire life. As a kid, Paul would take these trips to the beach with his family, and there was a pylon out in the water, a piling. As the tide would come in, it would slowly be covered until it was gone. And then as their day went on, as their day ended, it would slowly emerge from the ocean. And he was fascinated by it. And as he's waking up from this haze where he doesn't know where he is, he doesn't know what's happened, he's imagining this tide coming up and covering the pylon, and slowly comes to realize that the tide is something covering up this pain.
It's the ebb and flow of pain. And what was really interesting about his memory is that he said his family would always put their beach blanket right like within sight of that piling so that they, when the tide came up and it was covered, this is how I interpreted it anyway, they wouldn't accidentally bang their legs on it. And as I was reading that, my legs kind of tingled a little bit. It made me feel physically uncomfortable. Thinking about what that actually meant for him. Because it's Misery. I haven't read it, but I know. So I had an idea of what the problem was.
Yeah. He slowly, through this haze of semi-consciousness, comes to realize that the piling that it is slowly covering up is his shattered legs. And that through this haze, he has a vague memory of a woman coming in and feeding him medication and the tide coming in. And my favorite line in the book is him talking about how even as a kid he understood that it wasn't the tide, it was the piling. The piling was always there, and without that the tide, there would be no tide. And tying that to this pain that he's experiencing kind of fleshes out the theme of the story, which is, once again, Stephen King book. This is an addiction story more than anything else. Because while he's captive of Annie Wilkes, he's just as much captive of the pain medicine, the codeine-based pain medicine, Novril, that she is feeding him. I thought it was fascinating.
And I thought the first few chapters were really interesting. There are a couple of things that stuck out, specifically how Paul is becoming conscious of Annie in his descriptions of her. And I made a note of a couple of them. So Annie, before Paul really comes to, Annie ends up giving him mouth to mouth because, as we find out, she accidentally kind of overdoses him a little and it affects his respiration. So she's giving him mouth to mouth and it's not a pleasant experience.
Yeah.
And I wrote down his description of her, which is carried through in such a cool way. I found it really fascinating. So to start, he describes her mouth to mouth as a mixed stench of vanilla cookies and chocolate ice cream and chicken gravy and peanut butter fudge, with a taste as dry and dead as strips of salted leather, and she, quote, raped him full of her air again, end quote.
Ugh.
Which clearly sets the tone of this situation, and we know that it's not going to be good for Paul. The other passages that describe her physically, the taste of her fingers when she jams the painkillers, as you said, Ben, into his mouth, and the description of how she's built, a big lady, but with no curves or nothing that signifies any femininity, and a feeling about her of clots and roadblocks rather than welcoming orifices or even open spaces, areas of hiatus. She gave him a disturbing sense of solidity, like there were no blood vessels or internal organs, no eye sockets, and her eyes were painted on.
Yeah, it really makes Annie Wilkes, who's just a person. This is, other than different seasons, the first novel we've read with no supernatural, spoiler alert, I guess, for ETM. There's no supernatural elements to this story.
I didn't even notice. I was so swept away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Me
because she is such an imposing, terrifying figure.
She is supernatural.
Yeah, she's
somehow.
Just after that description, when he writes that as if she might be only solid Annie Wilkes from side to side and top to bottom, that she's a sturdy gal. Mm-hmm. And I love that his description immediately makes her inhuman. It makes her basically like a golem, as if she is an object that was created and is a force of nature unto itself.
Do you know what that part reminded me of?
What?
Another character we are familiar with, who was solid, had no insides, was just a mass. Mr. George Stark. Another villain to a Stephen King writer type, who was he had no insides. He just was.
That's true. I guess I didn't really think about that.
And that's such a
He writes such cool bad guys. It's so awesome.
It's such an upsetting imagery.
It
what I'm
is.
trying
It's
to
very
say.
upsetting.
Yeah, it's just so eerie. And like the little details about just how effortlessly strong she is too. Like when he realizes that to get him home, she would have had to by herself carry him as dead weight.
Mhm.
Even just that small feat in a storm is just impressive. It just shows like how strong and powerful she is.
Mhm.
And later on, when he brings the Royal in,
Yep.
when she brings the Royal in, 50-pound typewriter that he describes as her lifting it as effortlessly as he would lift an empty cardboard box.
Yeah, that's so crazy.
It's really interesting because when Paul finally does come to, Annie's sitting near his bed and she's reading his latest Misery novel. So he recognizes the guy on the novel because it's him.
Mhm.
And he asks where he is and she introduces herself and he cuts her off and he doesn't remember the details of the accident or her bringing him in or her taking care of him for however long it's been. But he says, "I know, you're my number one fan." So what did you guys make of that? Like he immediately just has this sense and impression of her that he's in trouble.
Well, it's from the first line of the book, the first chapter, those 4 lines of gibberish. If you read them phonetically, it's her. It's Annie, even in, what's the line? It's these noises, even in the darkness, or something like that.
Mhm.
And it's the gibberish is her looming over him, even as he's comatose, saying, "I'm your number one fan. I'm your number one fan."
Do you have to look at me when you say that?
Yeah.
You guys, Ben's got this
"I'm
look
your
in his
number one
eyes that
fan."
I don't like.
God, that is
Don't-
creepy.
Don't make this something it's not, you dirty birdie.
oh my Ah.
That is my favorite Annieism. Is Dirty Birdie.
Cock-a-doodie, man. You gotta.
Cock-a-doodie's fine, but I like Dirty Birdie.
You guys, okay, I listened to this on Audible. Our sponsor, go to
Ooh.
Sponsor audible.com.
freetrial.com/Derry.
Sure.
Or something similar to that. And the woman who read it did such an amazing job that I couldn't listen to the podcast right when I woke up in the morning. I had to give myself a buffer of something kind of lighthearted and funny until I felt like I was in the world again, because she is terrifying.
Oh,
That's
awesome.
interesting. Did she read the entire book read by this
it's
woman?
just one person.
That's
She is
interesting.
Amazing. She's one of the best voice actresses I've heard.
Huh. Because having the story told from Paul Sheldon's point of view, that's interesting.
Yeah, but the book's not about Paul. It's about Annie.
Oh, I disagree.
Hence
do I
CM's
dis-
description at the
Wait a
beginning of the
second.
episode.
Do I disagree?
I don't know,
I don't think I do.
right?
Okay. This is actually a point I wanted to bring up.
Good.
Name Paul's qualities. What is Paul like?
He's kind of whiny.
He has shattered legs and a drug addiction.
Exactly. Well, Paul is
Sorry.
Forgive my whininess if I ever have my legs look like shattered branches.
Don't call me to come help you, I guess.
But Paul is like kind of a blank page. We're supposed to be experiencing this. At least I felt myself experiencing this through Paul's eyes. And he himself, like, we know he's a writer. We know that he's been divorced twice. But we don't know that much.
We don't know his character, really.
Yeah, because this all-encompassing pain is really all he can deal with, right?
Right. Well, and the only real glimpse, there's 2 times where we get kind of a glimpse of his before Annie time, and that's when he talks about the night of the accident and finishing his new book, and then at the very, very end of what we read, he talks about how productive he is when his life isn't full of the distractions. And then he lists a bunch of like the things that he used to do that would distract him from his writing, that would put it off. But other than that, but those aren't even very detailed. It's just like, oh, here are things I would do instead of writing that now I don't have those distractions. So I'm knocking this out.
Right. When he says, yeah, I can't even smoke. because when I asked for cigarettes, Annie stared at me in such a way that I immediately dropped the subject because that's how terrifying she is.
Right.
So you weren't reading the story from Annie's perspective.
No, were you?
In a way, a little bit.
No.
This book is a love letter between Stephen King and his fans. And yeah, it's a fucked up love letter, but it's about that dependent relationship.
What the description of this is a love letter.
I was gonna say,
wow.
I was gonna say, what's the opposite of a love letter?
An apathy letter?
Love hate, man. It's a love-hate relationship. It's not a healthy relationship all the time.
Yeah.
But she did save his life. Like, because of her, he ends up doing something pretty awesome. I mean, she's
Fair.
insane and wrong. And she
also got him addicted to drugs, something that Stephen King was actually dealing with during the time of this writing. This was in his hard drugs era.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God, how much of this is autobiographical? Because he even uses the phrase constant reader to describe Annie.
Yeah, that was super cool. I was super excited. Oh God, Ben.
You okay?
Guys, are we the bad guys?
No. Okay, that's why it's a love letter and it's a love-hate relationship. Sometimes, yes, we are the bad guys. And sometimes we aren't. We're the savior.
Let's be bad guys.
Oh, okay. This took a turn.
Sorry.
All right. I'm going to rope this in.
Okay, yeah. We're going off the rails.
Okay. So Annie tells Paul about finding his wreck and how she pulled him out, took him back to her house. And during this, he never asks the obvious question, like, why didn't you take me to the hospital? Did that bother you guys? Did you want him to ask that? Did you want him to have that confrontation with her?
Well, actually, I kind of expected him to, and then I'm trying to remember if this is either if we're just before or just after this, that the line where he says that he discovered 3 things almost simultaneously about 10 days after having emerged from the dark cloud. The first was that Annie Wilkes had a great deal of Novril. The second was that he was hooked on Novril. And the third was that Annie Wilkes was dangerously crazy.
I think that's after.
Is that after this? It was like the way she the way she responded to him and the way she treated him. He always, like, once he could collect himself enough to even have coherent conversation, he knew that he had to stay on her good side. Mm-hmm. And he does enough, like, deductive reasoning, I think, to explain that why he doesn't go ahead and ask that question. One, I think it's because he's afraid of the answer he would get.
Yeah.
Which is fair.
The second thing is he's afraid of what she would do if it felt like he was ungrateful. Mm-hmm. And so in that circumstance, I don't think I'd ask. But that's just me.
Annie also tells Paul that she's read all of his Misery books, sometimes 5 or 6 times. And that was definitely a moment I was like, oh God, I'm Annie. And we also find out that she's currently reading his last book, Misery's Child. And he just wrote a manuscript for a new novel, Josh, you mentioned, called Fast Cars, something that he is really, really proud of and excited to publish. And he's recalling his last few days before the accident as Annie's going on about the day she found him, and the way that it's written, these 2 accounts, his memories and her tale, keep cutting each other off. So because I listened to the book, and then I actually had to pick up the e-version so I could figure out what the heck was going on, like, for this podcast piece. But when I was listening to it, it was so disjointed and confused, the way I feel like it's supposed to be experienced. When I was reading it, I didn't have that same, like, I felt more grounded. And I thought that was really cool. Like, I kind of wish you guys could have experienced that passage that way, because I was in my car like, what is happening?
Yeah.
For me, it was one of those moments where we've had it in multiple Stephen King books where I noticed that as I'm reading, like, I start reading faster. And during that whole disjointed sequence, I was so excited about the way it was jumping back and forth that I was just, like, leaning into my Kindle and just like, yeah, this is awesome. The way the storytelling is fucking great. I was so jazzed about it.
And it plays into how at this point in the story, he's only been awake for a couple days at this point.
Yeah.
I don't
he's
know.
only been conscious for a few days, but he has no idea how long he's been there yet.
He doesn't know. He hasn't looked at his legs yet. At this point.
So he's still practically in this haze, and it makes sense that, like, as she's telling him this, these memories are kind of drifting back to him. So it is very having that, like, give and take in the writing. Gives you that feeling of unearthliness, of like remembering. It's amazingly written. I love you, Stephen King.
Annie finds Paul's manuscript of Fast Cars, and she asks him if she can read it. And he's in such pain from what he thinks are probably his shattered legs and pelvis, although, like I said, he still hasn't gotten to that point where he's pulled back the covers to investigate. But he says yes, and as she's having this conversation with him, she's sort of holding them, like she's not giving them to him, so it's clear that he has to do what she wants. And I want to talk about their exchange because it's a really interesting conversation that they have around her asking him this question, which is Annie telling him that she loves him. And then she immediately kind of like realizes what she says and corrects that.
So gross.
To say that she loves him for his mind. And he says, I know, you're my number one fan. Give me those effing pills.
That the way she can not only be an all-out monster, and the terrifying, like, when anytime he asks a question she doesn't like and she goes kind of like catatonic faced for a second and he sees that darkness, but then to also doing those little things like actively, like passively holding the pills hostage until she gets what she wants. Like she runs so many different ways of manipulation and abuse that you have no idea every time she enters the room which Annie you're getting and what direction she's going to come at you from. And that is so scary.
I wish I was more knowledgeable of psychological disorders, because I feel like we could have an entire episode just trying to diagnose Annie Wilkes.
Probably.
Because something ain't right up there. But it's that there's actually a thing called intermittent explosive disorder, which is almost exactly what Annie Wilkes displays on a few instances, where just for no reason, I'm gonna hit you. Like,
no, well, she has a reason. It doesn't make sense.
Stop siding with Annie on things. You are creeping me out.
CM, okay, let's take a slight diversion. CM.
Ben, should we tell her we haven't been recording and this is an intervention?
I was going to say, okay.
I hate you guys.
quick hypothetical here.
Oh, yeah.
Quick hypothetical.
If I found Stephen King in a crash on the side of the road, would I drag him into my house and nurse him back to health?
Yes.
And I'm not a psycho. I'd call the hospital right away.
You answered way too fast because you had the question already loaded. I don't trust any of what's just happening right now.
I can see the notes on your phone. It says, don't admit to it.
No, my point is,
don't let them into the basement.
To Annie, she has a method and she has a reasoning. Does it make sense to mentally healthy people? No. Does it make sense to her? Sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it does.
That is very true. Because as Paul like gets more abused, he starts piecing together the things that trigger her, the things that when he says things a certain way, like he pays attention to what her face is doing at all times. And he starts really towing the line of what will keep him with the drugs coming and not being injured anymore, because he's figured out how to kind of game the system. But the great thing about Annie is that every time, I love it, the moments when he's like, all right, I think I've really got her on this one. And then she responds in a way he's not expecting. And then he's like, maybe that wasn't a good idea. I guess we're going to find out. Because she's just so erratic.
So let's talk about Annie's initial reaction to fast cars, not what ends up happening, but when she first starts, I think she reads through like 40 pages.
Mm-hmm. And she does not care for it because it's not Misery.
And she
also,
doesn't
it sounds
like
stupid.
It really
reminds
does.
It sounds
me
like a
of,
really stupid fucking
sound
book.
good.
What's
It's
that?
Stud City?
Stud City. I was
Yeah.
like, this is
It's
just like Stud
super
City.
Stud
God,
City.
thank God we didn't have to read an excerpt from it.
I was really happy about that. I was kind of waiting for it, worried.
I would have been so annoyed.
It's just word for word Stud City.
Stud City, yeah.
Yeah.
What I thought was interesting about that moment is that she has such a bad reaction to it because she doesn't like the confusion that the character feels, which is huge foreshadowing for what's to come.
Yeah.
And I didn't catch that until I read it through a second time. And she also didn't like the profanity. And I laughed out loud. And maybe it's because I heard someone actually saying these lines. So I'm going to do the same thing for you guys. When she's arguing with him about the profanity of the book, she's telling him people don't use profanity the way they do in fast cars. Because his argument is people talk that way. And she's like, no, they don't. And she says, what do you think I say when I go to the feed store in town? Now, Tony, give me a bag of that effing pig feed and a bag of that bitchly cow corn and some of that Christing ear mite medicine. And what do you think he says to me? You're effing right, Annie. Coming right the F up. And
Unfair. I do talk like that. Especially I will be working the word bitchly into my lexicon.
Bitchly cow corn.
I like it.
Is that what it is? I love it.
she goes on to give some other examples, and while doing that, lets something slip, something about her past and being on the stand in Denver. And this leads to their first, I think it's their first confrontation.
Yeah. This is when I think the first time he pieces together that he is certain she was a nurse. Because as they're having this conversation, she's feeding him and talking about it. The way he describes it, she mindlessly wipes his mouth. And he's like, well, she can't be a doctor because a doctor wouldn't notice. So a nurse, she must have been a nurse, and that would explain how she knew about the medications. They've talked about how she fed him with an IV before he became conscious, and the CPR and all this. So he's like piecing this stuff together. And oh man,
Then she has her blow up.
oh my God.
Josh, you wanna?
That 0 to 60, because this is the first time we've seen her lose her shit, takes his bowl of soup and whips it into the corner of the room, and it shatters the bowl all over the place, and the food goes all over the wall. And the note that I made was in all caps, this escalated so quickly. I was so taken aback that how it just took off. Like, if you guys can't tell, I fucking love this book. I'm so
amazing.
Excited about this book.
She has this blow up and she leaves. And she leaves him without his medication. She comes back a while later and she's got a bucket and a rag. And she's like, I've got to clean this mess up. This is going to take a while. And he's like, well, can I have my pills?
He's shaking.
And
he's for the first time, a couple times, mentions he's shaking so hard that he's making the pain in his legs worse just by shaking, but he can't help it. That's how bad the pain is. And he's like begging her, and she just stone-faced. Nope, I have to clean this up. This mess that you made, Paul.
Yeah.
And she takes an insanely long time to do it. And then she does something so twisted, bonkers, disturbing.
Yep.
She gives him the medicine?
She sure does.
No, she gives him his pills, but she makes him take them with water from the bucket. She tips the bucket into his mouth. And he's trying to not throw up, because I think she even tells him, if you throw these up, that's it.
Yeah.
You're not going to get them again until your next dose. And so he's fighting back this revulsion as he's tasting kind of the grit and stuff from the rag is floating around in the bottom.
It's gray water.
Yeah.
It's so gross. And I love that he's just like continually trying to talk himself into not throwing up no matter how bad he wants to, because he knows, because the pain is so bad. And it is just exciting. It's so exciting.
You guys have very weird ways to describe this.
It's okay. Now, like, this book has given me all of like the adrenaline rushes and anxiety of like a giant action movie when it is a man in a bed.
I completely agree. It is so stressful. It's and okay, I thought of this while I was reading it, and it sounds bad, but I mean it in the best way. This book is essentially torture porn. Like,
Okay.
this book is at least the first half that we've read. It is just so focused on Paul's suffering. It is so intricately detailed in the horrible things and the horrible fate that he sees in front of him, at least until he starts the second half, our part 2, which we will get to, in which he begins writing again. Yeah, it's pretty dark, is what I'm trying to say.
What did you guys think of his daydreams where he's sort of writing? I thought of it like a screenplay of the possible scenario, trying to figure out what Annie meant by Denver and being on the stand. And he's got these characters in his head that he's imagining and this dialogue that's taking place. And he does that a few times throughout the book.
It's an interesting technique, writing technique on King's part, I think, because it's showing us that Paul has this amazing writer's imagination. He's able to literally see these things that he's coming up with, and he uses it to try to deduce things and try to figure things out. But it's also an amazing technique in that, since this is an entire book that takes place in essentially one room, it's a guy in a bed, it allows sections of the book to take place in places that we can't see.
It expands the world.
It expands the world, exactly. Yeah, I love, there's a few segments like that. And his dreams, when he is actually literally dreaming, several times that come up, and how he almost can't tell the difference until he wakes up. It is really fantastic. I think it actually does. I was maybe unfair to Paul earlier when I said he doesn't have any characteristics other than pain and is a writer / Stephen King analog.
Next, we come to Annie finishing Misery's Child. And she loses her shit when she finds out that Misery has been killed off at the end of the book. She ends up abandoning Paul, no food, no water, no meds, for 51 hours.
That is insane. And I love the fact that she she trashes the room. She almost bashes his head in with a pitcher of water.
He can tell she wanted to.
Oh yeah. And then she like overturned the table, and he sees that like his keys and stuff were in it, and he's like, "Oh, that's where those were. I didn't even think about what was in there." And then, but in the midst of that, the thing that I was like, "Oh, that's interesting," was that when she says she's seen hundreds of people die, and I was like, "Oh, oh God,
oh yeah,
this is not going to end well for anybody." But yeah, like leaving him for 51 hours,
and this part was so hard to read.
Yes, it was brutal.
Yeah.
And this is what I was talking about, the torture porn, essentially, of him just nothing to do. I can't even imagine. Like, at this point, he's looked at his legs. I think at this point is when he is looking at his legs now. And he says below the knee, they're unrecognizable as legs. And having to sit there with nothing, no food, no water,
pain.
For 3 days,
51 hours, and he drinks his own pee.
He drinks his own pee. He is just, it's so terrible, but not as terrible as what happens when Annie comes back.
And when she comes back, she gives him this speech about how she had to clear her mind, and she thinks she did a good job, but she knows her thoughts are often muddy, and she accepts that.
God.
And the whole time I'm thinking, oh no. And she tells him that God told her that she has to show him the way. And so she has to, like, she takes off again. And she comes back and she has a couple things with her. She has a box of matches, a charcoal grill, and fast cars.
The only copy of Paul's manuscript that he spent 2 years writing, that he is proud of, that he describes earlier in the book that he writes 2 kinds of books, good books and bestsellers.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a book that he's killed misery. He doesn't have to write these books he doesn't even like anymore. And this book represents him becoming free. He's free to write what he wants again. And she is asking him to burn the only copy. And this was the one point in the book I had to put the book down. I was done for the day, because there's this lengthy bit where she's saying, you have to burn it. I can't burn it for you. And he's refusing, saying, no, I will not do it. And crying. And she's waving a box of Novril over him, saying, you do not get this until you burn this book. And he is saying, no, I will not. And she says, well, I have all the time in the world. And she walks out the door. Chapter break. The first line of the next chapter is, when she came back, I asked for the matches. And I had to put the book down.
I had the same note, like that fight that he has, and it's so passionate, and he's ripping himself apart because, like, why am I fighting my pride? I should just do this, but no, I can't give up on this. And then in one sentence, an hour later, she came back and he took the matches.
It shows how broken he is. It shows the power this addiction has over him. That was the point where I'm like, it went from Annie Wilkes is crazy and scary to I hate this character, but in a really good way.
And that scene ends with him swallowing the pills after he's burned the manuscript and thinking, I'm going to kill her.
Yeah.
Yes.
More importantly, guys, we do get the first lines of Fast Cars.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Yeah.
I have them here if we'd like to.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we had to go back for Stud City, guys, we're going back for
share.
Fast Cars. The opening line of this book. I don't have no wheels, Tony Banizzaro said, walking up to the girl coming down the steps. And I'm a slow learner, but I am a fast driver.
Jesus. Give Paul Sheldon a Pulitzer.
Oh, God. And I just love that that's the sentence he's so proud of. This is going to be the best book ever.
Oofa doof.
I'm sorry. I really felt that was important to the story.
It really adds to the podcast.
But then he wakes up in the wheelchair after that, right? He takes the drugs and passes out.
And so I think some time passes between, because he's starting to think about his car. The snow is melting and he's fantasizing that people are going to be driving by and somebody's going to call the cops, and then the cops are going to come and question Annie. And he's been with her long enough at this point, even though he still doesn't know quite how much time has passed, that he realizes if something like that does happen, she'll probably kill them both.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And absolutely. This woman is super unstable. And the added ticking clock to the book really ratchets up the non-action. Well, the first action scene of the book is coming up, actually, right?
Yes. So she comes back and she's bought a wheelchair and an old typewriter that's missing the letter N. And she tells him that he's going to write a new novel. And not just any new novel, but his best novel, Misery's Return. He's going to bring misery back. And the really funny thing is that she's 100% right. It's going to be his best novel. He's going to bring her back. Annie knows her shit.
Stop siding with Annie on things.
It is actually, once he starts writing the novel, and this is skipping ahead quite a bit, But I actually do love this, that she says, you're going to bring Misery back to life. He's like, how? That's ridiculous. And once he finally starts actually getting into writing the novel, he is not only writing this novel just to save his own life. He compares himself to Scheherazade in 1001 Arabian Nights, writing to save his life. He gets into it and he starts actually saying, oh, I thought Misery's Return didn't exist. It wasn't a real book. It was just a thing I was doing to save my life. But he starts saying, oh no, he starts finding the plot. He starts actually realizing that it is a good book. It's actually the best of his Misery novels. And so in a way, you're right.
I want to come back to their exchange over that when he first writes a couple of pages and then they have a conversation about it. But first I have to, we need to talk
that was
about...
skipping ahead a lot.
No, that's perfectly fine. But I want to talk about the constant reader reference, which I didn't realize was kind of a negative thing.
Yeah, apparently.
Yeah, so he's telling Annie what he needs to start writing. And one of the things is he calls it a concordance. It's all of his Misery information, because he's written like 7 books? Something like that. And so there's a lot of timelines, characters, things that he has to keep track of to make a cohesive story. And he notices that she does not care at all about the tricks of the trade. Anytime he starts talking technical stuff, like something fans might really dig into and be interested in, she kind of goes blank. And so that's when that reference comes about, the constant reader. She's the perfect audience, a woman who loves stories without the slightest interest in the mechanics of making them. She was the embodiment of that Victorian archetype, constant reader.
And later on, he says she gives a note, or she says it's after he's written the first draft, and she rejects it. And he says she rejects it with the constant reader's flat and uncontradictable certainty. And that was another point that I was like, oh, we're the bad guys here. Like, all of our opinions on this podcast have been called. He called us out. He predicted Stephen King podcasts.
Fans
was like,
don't
hey,
change.
Guys, come on.
It's true.
So they have, this is the next big fight that they have, and it's over paper, the type of paper that she's bought, because it's the most expensive type, because that's what she thought, spend the most money and that's going to get you the best quality paper, but it actually smudges. And so he's telling her that she needs to buy, and he kind of gets kind of snotty with her. Like he's trying to catch her off guard.
Yeah.
And he sort of, and Josh, you had mentioned, this is one of those moments when he thinks that he has something over her, and she just turns the tables right around on him. And you do not, or at least I did not expect that to happen. It's like, oh, she is perceptive.
Yeah.
She is on him.
The fact that she bull rushes from across the room, just charges at him with all of
Fists
the mass
raised.
that I imagine Annie Wilkes has, and punches him in what remains of his knee.
Yeah, because he made a reasonable request about paper. And made a point of, kept saying, I'm on your side, Annie. And she took that as a slight enough to punch him in a destroyed knee.
Well, he was lying to her and she knew it.
What? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's I mean,
so you're saying he had it coming,
he
CM.
wasn't
That's your argument.
I literally did not say that at all.
No, I guess you're right. He was on the book side. He was trying. He had a good point.
Well, I guess what I mean by that is he's pushing and he's testing her, and he thinks she's so crazy or so, dense and stupid because of the observations he kind of just made about the constant reader thing, that he takes it just a little bit too far. And he finds out
That's
the hard
fair.
way that she is not stupid. And she even says that. She tells him she's not stupid as she's screaming and rushing back into the room with her fists together, and then brings it down on his shattered knee. And she tells him, as she leaves, to sit there and think about who's in charge and what she can do to him if he tries to trick her.
Oof.
And nobody will come by to rescue him because everybody knows Annie Wilkes is crazy. They all know what she did, even if she was found innocent. Then she tells him they think she got away with it, and they were right.
Good.
Yup.
So crazy. Bananas. It's God, it's so intense.
Let's talk
So
about...
what part of Annie Wilkes did you feel sorry for again?
See, this is why I didn't want to mention it, because that's not coming up until part 2. Like our next episode. So everybody's going to think I'm crazy for 2 weeks.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And there are these moments as we go through where Josh, you alluded to this, like 1 minute, kind of almost like a normal person, and she's can be bashful at times and almost like humble and embarrassed.
Yeah,
and
she's very childlike.
Insane.
Yeah.
She's childlike. Even in her, he describes her like fits as childlike, like rages, and she's so naive about so many things.
And he is so dependent on her. And I think I'm gonna take all blame off my shoulders and say that Stephen King did such an amazing job writing about this relationship that as a reader, even though I should not be on Annie's side and she's crazy, I felt that connection that they have and that reliance on her, and sort of you'd want to protect that relationship in a way, because without her, you're dead.
Yeah. I hadn't thought of it that way.
All right, so let's talk about Paul's adventure into the house. Annie,
Yes. Our first action sequence.
As he grays out several times. The thing that I liked most about this scene is that, as we talked about earlier, him creating the cop that would find his car and creating these characters that exist, is that he creates a sportscaster in his mind to cheer him on and like help him like ramp up. And that was my favorite thing about this whole scene. So it's taking all of his focus because he's insanely like full of pain. And we find out that he's lifted a bobby pin from her at some point and uses it to pick a lock in his research for fast cars. The greatest book ever written. He learned how to pick a lock.
Oh, did he discover how to pick locks before Mr. Picklocks did?
What?
Wait,
the Heimlich maneuver.
What the fuck are you talking about? How could you have
discovered by
possibly
Mr. Picklock?
expect us to follow that logic?
I always forget about Samuel Picklock, who invented picking locks.
I feel like the look I gave you guys when I dropped that line was
You were so
I was
proud
so
of it.
confident that you had my back.
Oh, what a good bit this is!
And you didn't.
I was honestly baffled. I was like, "What?"
That's amazing.
Okay, so I like this this segment because, like, yeah, he knows how to pick locks because of his research during this book, and he's in so much pain. Like, he just got punched in a pulverized knee, and he's in so much pain that he keeps blacking out. He says at the start that, like, in retelling these events, in retrospect, I suppose there could be people that could describe my actions as heroic. But they weren't. They were purely self-preservation. Because he picks the lock and he gets the wheelchair out of the door just barely. He was afraid that it isn't gonna fit. And the entire reason for him leaving is just so he can find more Novril, because he at this point recognizes that he's a junkie. Essentially, he is going as much pain as he's also going through withdrawals, and he needs it. And he finds a giant box in her bathroom rather, full of samples of extremely addictive medicine that she should not have. Another big wait, what moment? Like, what did you guys think of that?
Yeah, that was definitely a sign that something happened in Denver. Something had been happening for quite some time. she's doing a lot of things that are not legal.
Yeah. At least 2.
This adventure out, I shouldn't call it an adventure. That's kind of gross. This terrible journey outside of his room to find the painkillers and him picking that lock. It's so excruciating. And it's a long part. You're on the edge of your seat reading this or listening to it, wondering what's going to happen. He even has I don't know if he hallucinates or he falls asleep in dreams, but he's in the hallway, I think, and he imagines that Annie is there.
Yeah, this is one of those dream sequences I mentioned earlier that he grays out because he's exerting himself so much. And when he comes to, Annie is standing over him with a shotgun pointed at his head and says, "If you wanted your freedom, Paul, all you had to do was ask for it." And then as she pulls the triggers, he wakes up and realizes she's not actually there. But she could come home at any second because he doesn't know how long he's been out.
Yeah. And he doesn't know how far she has to go.
Yeah.
He has no concept of time anymore as far as anything outside this house now, mostly outside his room.
And the only way he knows that time has even passed throughout this, as we mentioned, 51 hours, is that there's a cuckoo clock or something, and he hears every hour. Yep. And so he finds the meds and he takes a couple boxes, and then he goes out into the rest of the house and he sees a telephone. And he's going to try the telephone.
He knocks over a tiny penguin and catches it, which I thought was kind of cool because he had taken the medicine. As soon as he found it, he took 4 pills, which is more than he definitely should have. Yeah. And he knocks over this tiny penguin, and he just described without thinking of it. He reaches out and catches it, but freaks out because he's like, if that would have broken, I would be fucked.
Yeah.
But he puts it back, and then he goes over to the telephone.
He's like, I'm too stoned for this.
And of course, the phone is dead. The phone does not work.
She glued the jack shut.
Well,
that's what he imagined.
Oh, yeah. So I guess that wasn't real,
because it's all like the whole thing about her keeping up appearances.
Yeah.
Right.
So he hears her car coming back, and he's like getting back to his room as fast as he can. It's very painful to read about. She comes in. He realizes he got back to his room and he got the door shut and locked. Didn't take the boxes of pills out of his lap. So he's got his hands in his lap, covering him. She comes in. He's like exerted so much energy, looks just terrible. And she's like, oh my gosh, what is wrong? Are you okay? And she asks him why he has his hands in his lap. And I was like, how is he going to get out of this? And he just starts sobbing. And he says, please, Annie, I've held it for so long. I didn't want to make a mess. And she kind of she softens, like, oh, mean old Annie left you. And she goes and gets him the bedpan. So then
every time they describe Annie as acting maternally, barf.
Yeah.
So we come to part 2, and we're going to go a few minutes into this because part 2 is not quite halfway through the book. So at this point, Paul has started to type, and he's written a few pages, and they suck. I remember, because you get excerpts of them, and they are not good. And I remember thinking, his misery books aren't very good. Like, they're really cheap.
Yeah, I mean, that's the reason he hates the misery books, is they are cheap Harlequin romance novels. They're crappy supermarket paperbacks that your mom would read, and he hates them. And you get this long segment of one, and it's very cheesy and
really cheesy.
I love all the handwritten ends in it, though. That was just such a nice touch.
It really is.
But Annie says that it's not right.
She says it's a cheat.
Yeah, she says it's cheap, and she explains about the weekly movie shorts.
Chapter plays.
The chapter plays.
Serials.
Yeah. And that how furious she tells that story about Rocket Man.
Yeah, when she was a girl, she'd go to the theater with her brother.
And she had to be like almost dragged out of the theater because the episode ended on a cliffhanger, and when it came back, they like worked around the cliffhanger to make him escape. And she was like, that's not how it happened. That's not it. Because he wrote kind of an alternate universe version of this story
where they're like, wouldn't it have been terrible if Misery died?
Right. And so and because this book is just for her. She makes it very clear that no one will read this book but me. This is my book. And so I understood his thought process of like, all right, let's just pretend this thing she hated never happened.
And he adds her into the book.
Yeah,
which I thought was a funny touch.
Yeah, and then she explains all this, and he's like, yeah, I guess that is a cheat. So I'll get to work.
Yeah, he realizes she's right, and so he knocks out, like, we get 7 chapters then of his new start, and it's interesting. Like, I'm
it's
like,
very
cool.
good.
I would read Misery, and she makes an interesting suggestion. She tells him, "What if it was a bee?" What did you guys think about her? Because he kind of dismisses it at first, like sort of explaining how Misery.
Yeah, she was buried alive.
Yeah,
and they all think she's dead, and they're gonna rescue her from her grave, is how the story goes. And she loves the story, like she thinks it's great. Everything is written, and then just on her way out, what if it's bees?
I thought that was cool because it's the way it's not a demand. It's not a I had an idea, put my idea in your book.
Yeah.
It is simply she's described as being in awe of him while he's writing. That she knows that she is not a part of this creative process. She almost acts as though Paul is godlike. That's why she got so mad that Misery died, is that Paul killed her.
Yeah,
because Paul is the god of the story.
The way she treats him when she's not being totally crazy is sort of, that illustrates, her suggestion and the way she gave it, that relationship again between the writer and the fan.
There are 2 things in the book of his Misery story that I thought were like really interesting. The one that I loved the most was that he describes the one character's emotional pain the same way he describes his physical pain with the tide, the whole tide coming in. I was like, it was so cool to see that him work that into it, because you can tell he's really putting himself into the story. Because he also before that he talks about the process of getting an idea versus having an idea,
right?
And he's really, like, now that he's hit that stride, like, he's putting so much of himself on the page that whether he realizes it or not, the thing he's been thinking about, his pain, he has worked into this story. And I just thought that was really, really awesome of King to slip in there.
I also like that in the second draft, which is much darker, he says it's much darker and more gruesome than any of the other Misery books. It's a gothic story. Instead of writing in Annie into the book as the night nurse, he just has a doctor character casually mention that the Roymond baby died.
Yeah!
Which the Roydmans are a neighbor of Annie's that she hates.
Yes!
I missed that.
I made that note too.
I thought was an amazing allusion to that he's still trying to like appease Annie to like make this, pander to her, but in this darker version of the story, he's doing it in a darker way.
Yeah,
I thought was awesome.
That is really good.
And he panders to her in another way too, which it has 2 purposes. He sees over the next course, there's like a couple days that go by as he's writing, and he realizes that he left marks on the door when he put his wheelchair through, and he's terrified that she's going to see that and know that he left his room. And as this is happening, somebody pulls up in the driveway, and it's somebody from the city delivering a notice to Annie that she hasn't paid her property taxes, and if she doesn't pay them by like noon that day, they're going to put a lien on her property. So Paul tells her to take the money in his wallet and pay it, because he says, consider it a down payment for everything you've done for me.
Right.
And he wants to get rid of her so he can clean up the wheelchair marks.
Yeah, it's
But I also think it's important to note that person didn't just show up. She gagged him, handcuffed him to the bed, and then said, if you make a sound, I'll kill him, then you, then myself.
I'm not trying to
CM
downplay.
sides with
Okay, whatever.
Annie on every angle she takes.
yeah. But yeah, in his his situation, yeah, Paul does do this and plays it off as this Annie. What does he say? If you don't think I'm grateful for everything you've done for me, you're crazy. Which I thought was funny.
Yeah.
But he plays it off, and she is touched by this act of selflessness
or gratitude. I guess.
Gratitude, and she's touched by it. And she won't even take the money out of his wallet. She gives him his wallet and takes the money out. He gives it to her, and she leaves. And as she's leaving, she turns and says, "I love you, Paul."
Gross.
Super gross.
Gross, totally gross.
I have a feeling you have an alternate headcanon. You're like working on your misery / fiction in a secret notebook somewhere.
It's you guys, you accused me, and I kind of I thought, are they a little bit right? And the only thing you can do is just double down on it.
Steer right into it.
I like it.
All right, well, that is it for this episode of Derry Public Radio. As always, thank you for listening. Join us for our next episode for part 2 of Misery, which will cover the rest of the book. For Benjamin Graham and C.M. Alexander, I am Joshua Kahn, reminding you that there comes a point when the very discussion of pain becomes redundant. No one knows there is pain the size of this in the world. No one. It is like being possessed by demons.
Hey everyone, CM Alexander here. We hope you enjoyed part 1 of Misery. We'd like to give a shout out to Paul Ferguson for suggesting this book. We're all really into it so far. Although I'm not sure why Josh and Ben gave me such a hard time about Annie Wilkes. You know, I would name my next cat Misery. Is that weird? Have any of you named your pets after a Stephen King character? Tell us on our Facebook and Instagram at Derry Public Radio or Twitter at Derry Public. You can also send any questions or comments to our email, derrypublicradio@gmail.com. And you can listen to Derry Public Radio everywhere you listen to podcasts. Please like and subscribe, and we would really appreciate it if you'd leave us a review on iTunes so more people can find us, even if your review is just the name of your favorite Stephen King book. That's it for now. Goodbye, you dirty birdies.